Hello there, it's Mrs. Scoville, and today we're going to be learning about pedigrees, and we're going to focus on the modes of inheritance that we learned about with the pedigrees. Okay, so for today's lesson, there are three objectives. The first is to interpret a pedigree and see both affected and unaffected individuals in a family, label individuals in a pedigree, and then finally to identify the four different modes of inheritance in a pedigree that we're going to focus on. That is going to be the main part of our lesson. Before we get into it, I do want to recap a couple of things with you. So for starters, up to this point, what we know is meiosis, the process of meiosis, which makes gametes, is going to be what is going to determine what chromosomes are distributed and are inherited in offspring. When those gametes come together and undergo fertilization, that's what actually creates the offspring. Our Punnett squares, we use those to predict how the gametes will be divided up using the law of independent assortment. And again, they get separated because of that law of independent assortment, and we just use our Punnett square to make those predictions. A pedigree is basically a picture. It's a chart that we're going to use to look at how those traits are inherited in a family or in a group of people over time. So I've said here, pedigree is a visual map of chromosome inheritance, so it's a way for you to see, who has a trait and who doesn't. And this chart is also going to be something that we can use to determine the mode of inheritance. So again, pedigrees, we use them to look at traits over time. There are going to be some specific symbols that we look for in pedigree charts. For starters, you have to look and see if an individual is male or female. The way that that is represented is females are always circles, males are always squares. Okay, so that's just the convention. Females are circles, males are squares. If they do not have the trait, so if they're unaffected, they will not be colored in. Okay, so you can see the example here, it's just blank. If they do have the trait, that means they're affected with the trait, they have the trait, it'll be fully colored in. So those are the two you're always going to see. Sometimes too, you may also see something that looks like this, either a circle or a square that's half shaded in, or you may even see this where it's like a circle with a dot or a square with a dot. Those are going to be what's called a carrier, and those are essentially heterozygotes. That means they have one copy that's recessive and one that's dominant in most cases. We will not see those in all the pedigrees, but if you see it, that's what it means. The other thing that you're going to see in pedigrees is lines, and if the lines are next to each other, that means it's a marriage. So marriage or a mating, not necessarily marriage, but a mating. And again, remember the square is male and the female is a circle. When we look at a pedigree chart, we can actually use that again to identify individuals if we're given a description. So mating is when the individual lines connect together, but any vertical lines that go down, so we saw like these two would be a mating, any vertical lines that go down mean children. Okay, so all of these are connected to each other. These are all children. These are not mating with each other, but these two would be. So here we're given a description that says Sarah and John Fox have brown hair, as do their children, Ella, Alan, Chase, and Ava. Their son, John Jr., however, has blonde hair. Based on this pedigree, we can actually determine exactly who is who. So this must be the parents. So this must be Sarah because it's female, and this must be John because it's male. They have a bunch of children, and only one of them has this blonde hair, which must be the trait. They're the only one that's different. So this has to be John Jr. And then the other ones, we can't fully tell, but we can, kind of figure out at least male and female. So we've got two girls and two boys. So let's say this one's Ella and this one's Ava. Now we can't tell for sure which one is Ella and Ava, but those would be the right traits. And same thing here with Alan and Chase. So given a description with a high degree of probability, you can figure out who is who in a pedigree. So that's how you go through that process. Okay. When we're looking at a pedigree, the other thing that a lot of times people will do is identify who has the trait using generational numbers. And to do this, we're going to use Roman numerals, and I want you to actually write these in on your pedigree. So it's just 1, 2, 3. You always start at the top and work down. So those are the generations. This would be the oldest generation, like grandparents, parents, children. Once you've done that, the next thing is you identify the generation, and then within the generation, you number the individual starting from 1. It always just restarts at 1 from left to right. So if we looked at this generation, that would be 1, 2. And again, it restarts at 1 in each generation. This is just so that there's a common language when you're talking about individuals in a generation. And again, it always just restarts at 1. So to recap, Roman numerals in the generations, 1, 2, 3. You could have 4 or more generations, and then just 1 on in going from left to right. So in here, individual 2, 2, 2, 5, and 3, 1 are all affected with whatever this trait is. And so again, that just gives us a common language. Looking at our pedigrees, we're not going to be able to identify all of the modes of inheritance. Well, technically you can, but we're not going to because some of them are quite difficult. But there are 4 that we're going to focus on, and these were some of our modes of inheritance we saw. So the first that we'll look at is autosomal dominant, then autosomal recessive, and then we're going to look at 2 versions of a sex-linked trait. So look at X-linked dominant and X-linked recessive. As a reminder, autosomal dominant and recessive, those are considered Mendelian, whereas sex-linked, a lot of times, that's not necessarily something that would follow normal predictions. All right, so first looking at autosomal dominant inheritance. This right here is actually a pedigree for autosomal dominant inheritance, but how you would actually identify that it is such is any individual that has the trait, so is affected, one of these that's colored in here, will have a parent that is affected, at least one parent. Because of that, we're going to see the trait present in every single generation. And because this is just overall dominant, you're not going to expect to see any gender bias, so both sexes are going to have it. And we can see that if we look here. Both males and females are being affected. Really here it's with exactly equal probability. The other thing is roughly 50% of the offspring are going to be affected. So in this case, we had 2 parents that were affected, so you'd expect it to be more than 50%. But down here, like this one was exactly 50%. Over here, these parents aren't affected and none of their kids are, so that would be consistent with dominant as well. So again, every single generation, you see it, and there's a lot of them that have it. That is all consistent with an autosomal dominant. And okay, 1, 2, 3. Don't forget about that. All right, so if we look at all of these examples, there are 4 different ones here. And which one of these would be most consistent with an autosomal dominant pedigree? Well, you just have to look and say, where are males and females both affected, and where is it mostly, 50%? It's D. So you can see it's in every single generation, and males and females are affected. All right, so our next one, autosomal recessive. This is a pedigree for an autosomal recessive, and again, let's talk about how you could identify that. So here, your trait is going to be more rare than it was in the autosomal dominant one, so it's usually less than half of your pedigree. The other thing that will happen is you're going to see some generations that do not have the trait. So if we look at this one, generation 1, it does not have the trait. So in this case, what happens there is the trait is actually hidden, and this is where that carrier comes in, because here the heterozygote is there and the dominant trait is masking it. So if you see a carrier on your pedigree, that's also a big hint that you have an autosomal recessive. So on this one, I can tell because this is autosomal recessive, I actually could go ahead and color these in if I wanted to. I know that both of these parents are, because if we think about our Punnett squares, if these are both heterozygotes, the only way that we're going to get this recessive trait is if the parents are carriers. So if you're looking at a pedigree and you see a carrier, that's a big hint that it's autosomal recessive as well. The other thing, males and females will be affected equally. That was also a thing we saw in the dominant one though. And then one thing that's kind of interesting here, inbreeding in families, or people do this with dogs actually, dog lines are really inbred, will increase the chance of seeing autosomal recessive. So a lot of people talking about inbreeding being bad, it's because autosomal recessives show up more often. And then again, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so here, which one of these would be autosomal recessive? Well, we have to look for skipping of generations and not high frequency, so that would definitely be A. All right, so now moving on to the sex-linked dominant, and really most of these are going to be linked to the X chromosome, so we'll look at these. So with our X-linked dominant, this is going to be common in our pedigree because it's dominant, but it may not be 50% in each case. The real pattern that we're going to look at, and I'm going to put a little star by this one, you need to look at the dads. Because if there are any dads, like right here, there's a dad that's affected, they will pass it only to their daughters. Their sons will not be affected. This is the best evidence that you have an X-linked dominant pedigree. So that pattern of dad to daughter only is only going to be found in X-linked dominant. If you have a mother that has the trait, so for example right here, if we look at individual generation 1, she's number 2, individual 1, 2, she is going to pass it on to both her male and female offspring, so her sons and her daughters. So she's not a great place to look if we're trying to figure out if this is X-linked dominant. Again, if you've got a father, you want to look at that. He's only going to pass it on to the daughters. In this trait overall, though, we're going to see males and females are about equally affected. So here, if we look for X-linked dominant, again, we need to look for that pattern of dad to daughter. I see it right there in B. Okay, so dad only gave it to his daughters. So that's definitely X-linked dominant. All right, and then our last one here, X-linked recessive. So an X-linked recessive, this one's probably the easiest to identify because more often than not, it's only going to be males that are affected. Sometimes you will have females affected, but it's still going to be more males that are affected. So when we're looking at these pedigrees, one thing that we can see is any father that's affected, so like individual 1-1 or 3-2, they're not going to pass it on to their sons. So we can see that this guy, 1-1, had a son right here, doesn't have the trait. Okay, the reason that this is going to happen is because it's passed on the X chromosome. Dad has an X and a Y. His son is going to get the Y. So he has the trait, but he's not going to pass it on to the son. That means that I know that these daughters who are XX must actually have the trait because they have to get an X from mom and an X from dad, and dad only has that X. So these are carriers. I could go ahead and shade this in as well. So just like with our autosomal with our autosomal recessive, we are going to have carriers here as well. With our dominant ones, we're not going to have any carriers. So here we know that he must have inherited the trait from his mom, okay? Because only the women are going to be carriers. As a result, traits will appear to skip generations. You won't see them in the meantime. So here, if we look at these pedigrees, which one is going to be X-linked recessive? So again, we're looking for mostly males affected and possibly skipping generations. That's definitely C. And then one more little note here, and that's with carriers. I do want to tell you, I kind of was shading them in as you go along. We're not necessarily going to see carriers, which again, they're heterozygous, shaded in on a pedigree. But we can infer it, as you saw me doing on that previous one. Okay, so if any of their children show a recessive trait, you can tell that the parents have to be carriers. And this is another example here. So here we've got a son, and color blindness actually is a sex-linked trait. And this son has it. Up here we know that this grandmom is a carrier, and she was a carrier female. And so we're wondering, with this son having it, is she a carrier or is she not? Well, she must be, because again, this is X-linked. So he must have the trait, and it has to come from mom because she's giving him the X. So mom, we could actually shade her in as well. She would be a carrier. So that's what I mean by you can infer as soon as you know the type of inheritance about carriers. So with that, we are at the end of our lesson. You can go ahead and write your complete summary.